The belief that louder recordings sell better has driven a trend toward greater and greater use of dynamic range compression. I'll explore some of the effects of the loudness war. Then I'll look at the problem in terms of game theory and question some underlying assumptions. When I talk about the loudness war, I'm not talking about the final playback level. That can always be adjusted by the listener. I'm talking about the effects of processing, hypercompression, limiting, and even clipping, used to make recordings sound louder than others with the same peak level. Our hearing curves become flatter at higher playback levels, so all other things being equal, louder tends to sound better. I saw this statement and I thought, that can't be right. So I found a digitized 1909 Edison cylinder recording. There's some surface noise, but it's got a pretty good range of levels. And below that, My Apocalypse from Metallica's Death Magnetic CD. And if we measure them with a dynamic range meter, we find the cylinder recording had 5 times the dynamic range of the Metallica song, and about twice the range of a typical 2010 release. This shows the reduction of dynamic range during the CD era, and conversely, the ongoing increase in average RMS levels. Without access to the original, we may not know how the mastering process affected the audio quality. But when a recording is remastered, we can compare it to previous releases. The marketing message is we're getting closer to the quality of the original master tape. The irony, of course, is that with each release, we're usually getting further from the original dynamic range. So, is the loss of dynamic range really a problem, and if so, how do we fix it? We'll look at a number of issues, beginning with sound quality. Dynamic range compression has a number of positive uses, but it can be taken too far. Hypercompression has been accused of removing dynamics, creating musical clutter, reducing the excitement and emotional power, and weakening the punch of transients. There are few studies, but clearly there's a range of effects, from subtle compression no one would notice to extreme effects almost anyone would hear. If we look at some extreme examples created for illustration, we see that hypercompression reduces contrast between verse and chorus. It takes the crescendo out of the bolero, removes the surprise from the surprise symphony, and turns Stairway to Heaven into a sidewalk. Those are examples of macrodynamic compression. Fast microdynamic compression tends to affect the individual transients. If we compare the original 1989 version of Chris Isaak's Wicked Game to the same song remastered in 2006, we find the dynamic range has gone from 13 to 7. The new version has some crunch distortion during the chorus due to clipping of the bass, especially on the word fall. And maybe it's my imagination, but it feels like some of the magic's gone with the background vocals. They were so low in the mix in the original. It was a great effect. And even if it is my imagination, you can easily imagine that with a little more compression, the background vocals would be right in your face. Not everything needs to be in the foreground. The impact of hypercompression may vary with different listeners, listening styles, and listening environments. Again, very little actual data, but we could imagine plotting the relationship between amount of compression and perceived quality for different listeners and situations. Audio professionals and active listeners may hear a loss of quality even for moderate compression. Casual listeners may not notice anything short of severe clipping. And compression may actually improve the listening experience in the car by making the quiet parts audible over road noise. Keep in mind that if the audio is mastered with a wide dynamic range, it can always be compressed further at the playback stage to satisfy most listeners. One way to get your message heard is to make it louder, but that can become tiresome. It's widely believed that hypercompression can cause listening fatigue. Even if people don't consciously notice a problem, The music may become mentally or physically tiring. Listeners may lose interest without knowing why. Again, surprisingly little experimental evidence, but there's a lot of anecdotal evidence. The term listening fatigue may have multiple meanings, such as physical ear fatigue and central nervous system fatigue. Fatigue is often mentioned as a problem with long listening tests, which raises the not entirely facetious question of whether experiments designed to measure listening fatigue might in fact corrupt their own results due to listening fatigue. And there's more about this in the paper. There's some concern over whether hypercompression may increase the potential for hearing damage, because the harm from excessive exposure is a function of the average sound level, and hypercompressed music has higher average levels. There's also speculation that just as we need frequent breaks from the keyboard to avoid carpal tunnel, we may need frequent rest periods from peak sound levels to protect our ears. A recent study found a significant increase in hearing loss among adolescents over a 15-year period. The losses are often slight, but may be permanent and may get worse with continued exposure. Many experts think the main cause may be the use of earbuds and headphones with portable music players. The ears adapt to loud sounds faster over headphones, so we turn up the volume. The bass is often weak, and our bodies don't feel the pumping bass that tells us the music's really loud, so we turn it up even more. And there's less air absorption at the damaging high frequencies, because the sound doesn't have to travel across the room. A study of Australian children found that personal stereo usage was associated with a 70% increase in the risk of hearing loss. Another study found that those who listen at high volumes for 5 hours a week, less than an hour a day, receive more noise exposure than permitted in the loudest factories. And another one, I found this one shocking. It showed that high-frequency hearing loss among adolescent females doubled over a 24-year period. During the last decade of the study, about half the subjects used personal stereos, half didn't. But of those with high-frequency hearing loss, 84% were regular users of personal stereos, and all but one of the subjects with tinnitus, 99.7%, used personal stereos. Tinnitus, some people call it tinnitus, ringing of the ears, it's often a precursor to hearing loss, and it seems to be strongly correlated with use of personal stereos. Now, does this have anything to do with hypercompression? That may depend on how listeners typically set the volume. If they set it according to average long-term loudness, they may essentially normalize for equal hearing damage. But if they set it by the highest peak level they're comfortable with, they'll receive more sound exposure with compressed music, which spends more time at the peak levels. So that really needs to be studied. This combination of hypercompression and earbud listening may be a perfect storm for hearing damage. A link between compression and hearing loss is hard to prove. On the other hand, the stakes are high. Most people don't give it much thought until the damage is done, and teens in particular tend to consider themselves invulnerable. I'm on shaky ground with this next one. It's hard to prove a causal relationship, and certainly there are major factors like online piracy, but it's at least conceivable that overcompression is one factor that has contributed to the decline of the music industry. Many of the best-selling albums had excellent dynamics, and maybe that's part of what people liked about them. The terms loudness race and loudness war remind us of the similarity to an arms race. But just as actual war is not fundamentally a chemical or nuclear engineering problem, the loudness war is not primarily an audio engineering problem. We can view the underlying problem in terms of game theory, a branch of mathematics that applies the study of games to topics like war and business. Some of the more interesting topics involve non-zero-sum games, partly competitive, partly cooperative. For example, during the Cold War, the US and USSR had a shared interest in avoiding mutual destruction. In 1984, Axelrod published a hopeful and influential book called The Evolution of Cooperation. He used Prisoner's Dilemma computer tournaments to show how cooperation could emerge from competition between greedy individuals, even with no central authority to police their actions. He found that the strategies that did best were the ones that focused on their own success instead of comparing themselves to others. In the case of the loudness war, the underlying problem has been referred to as loudness envy, which says it pretty well. If our mental model is based on zero-sum games, we tend to think in terms of beating the other guy, and maybe the easiest way to beat the other guy's song is just to make our song louder. In game theory, if players are misinformed about the cost and benefits, they can end up playing the wrong game. In the loudness war, there are a couple of areas where the payoffs can be misunderstood. First, one of the motivations behind the loudness war has been to make your songs sound louder on the radio. But typical FM processing adds so much additional compression that hypercompressed music just ends up sounding small and distorted. And here we come to the core issue. The main thing driving the loudness war has been this idea that hypercompressed music sells better, which in turn is based on the idea that listeners prefer louder songs. I want to question both assumptions, and I think they are assumptions because it's hard to release two versions of the same song and see which sells better. But we do have some data. Let's look at 4 studies. In the Evergreen project, Chris Johnson analyzed spectrograms from a number of the most commercially important albums of the last few decades. He found that the all-time best-selling albums were the ones with wide dynamic range. For example, he said the Eagles' Greatest Hits was the most commercially important album in RIAA history and has some of the most striking dramatic contrast pop music's ever seen. People want dynamic contrast. A dissertation by Dave Viney looked at 30 recent CD singles on the UK charts and found no significant correlation between loudness and sales. I made a scatter plot of sales rankings from the Billboard year-end charts 2002 through 9 versus dynamic range data from an online database. 173 albums appeared in both databases. The dots represent individual albums. The vertical bands are because the dynamic range data was quantized to 1 dB. The red trend line is almost horizontal, which means that a large change in dynamic range corresponds to a very small change in sales. The data points are scattered all over, and the correlation is not statistically significant. So the data fails to support a link between dynamic range, presumably correlated to loudness, and the Billboard rankings. Next, a recent and important study looked at the effects of radio sound processing on listener preference. Mainpole and Golick tested a number of music pieces and a variety of typical radio processing settings that varied in loudness and crest factor. One experiment was a conventional test, where you compared different types of processing using the same piece of music. To no one's surprise, listeners preferred the louder one. In an A/B test with the same song, you're straining to hear the slightest difference, and the only difference is the processing. But in real life, we don't choose between 2 versions of the same song. If I change stations, I hear a different song with a different type of processing. When they systematically co-varied the source material and processing, they found that the type of processing had very little effect on listener preference, which was strongly determined by the choice of source material. It's like, hey, I don't care if the apple's heavier, I want an orange. So maybe loudness doesn't trump everything. It looks like content largely swamps any differences in listener preference due to changes in loudness and compression. And differences due to loudness disappear the minute the listener adjusts the volume. We judge music based on many different factors. The brain may be more interested in things like melody, vocals, emotion, whether it's got a beat and you can dance to it, than it is in small loudness changes. People buy music, steal music, for any number of reasons, and loudness may play a very minor role. So maybe we've over-extrapolated from studies that compare the same song at different playback levels. Loudness may already have a minimal effect on listener preference and commercial success, but this idea is contrary to firmly held assumptions, possibly driven by loudness envy and groupthink. If we want to change the payoffs, we can reduce the relevance of loudness even more by building loudness normalization into the playback devices and, equally important, making that the default. Then, if you compress your music to make it louder, the normalizer just says, haha, too loud, and sets it back to the standard loudness. Some other ways of changing the payoffs could include providing a high dynamic range certification, giving awards for excellent mastering and engineering, and posting reviews on sites like iTunes and Amazon. But let's back up a second. This idea that loudness plays a minor role when comparing two different songs, wouldn't the same argument apply to the audibility of compression artifacts? In other words, if I go back and forth between two versions of the same song, sure, I can tune in to subtle differences due to compression, maybe hear some loss of punch, but if you played two different songs in a casual setting and asked me which one was compressed, I'm not sure I could tell you because there's so many other differences. It looks like as long as the compression is not too extreme, for example, no clipping, the side effects may not be immediately apparent to the casual listener. But the commercial advantage of hypercompression, the whole reason for doing it in the first place, may also be small or even non-existent. So, what to do? Should we cater to active listeners who want to discern musical subtleties? Or do we use the old loudness nonlinearity trick to try to con people into buying our songs, given that the trick may not even work? My personal feeling is, master it the way you'd like to hear it. Preserve the dynamics. It really shouldn't have much effect on the sales. Or we could try to make everyone happy. Sell the cheap hypercompressed version, but also provide a premium wide dynamic range version for the audiophile. Record companies could even use the loudness war as a kind of copy protection, so they can upgrade us to the high dynamic range version later. Now there's still the issue of possible hearing damage, and that's where we really need some research. How do people set the levels? Do they get more sound exposure with compressed music? The loudness war is a relatively minor issue in a world with financial meltdown, environmental destruction, real wars. People aren't dying from hypercompression. They're not marching in the streets singing anti-loudness war songs. But maybe it's all part of the same big picture, the vast human capacity to use our brain power to outsmart ourselves. I mean, who foresaw what MP3s and the internet would do to the industry by making music so easy to steal it wouldn't feel like stealing? Who anticipated that portable music players would be associated with increased hearing loss among young people? And who saw that digital audio, with its huge dynamic range, would lead to a dramatic reduction of musical dynamics? The music business is often more about business than it is about music. But if culture is important, if music's important, then how we produce and preserve our music may be important. I think it might be time to let go of the obsession with loudness and back off a little on the compressor.